Hello there. Between 2017 and 2018, I was unable to make YouTube videos due to the situation I was in. However, I still felt like I wanted a creative outlet. So, for a short while, I resorted to writing blogs. These came in many forms, including opinion pieces, film reviews, and even travel diaries. I recently went back to read some of these old pieces that I'd written, and I honestly still quite enjoy them. So I thought what might be fun is if I, on a medium I'm more familiar with, went back to share some of these pieces that I'd written over audio. And I should just like to say that some of the content in these pieces may be a little dated, either through the context of currently released films for some of the reviews, or in the case of this travel diary, changes in personal situations, outlook, and overall mood, all of which have changed recently. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoy. Here is a trip to Windermere, dated November 26th, 2017. I am a jackass. It has been 8 years since I've had a scrap of anything that can be considered a holiday or a break, and I've put off going on one since, on the grounds that, apart from never being terribly wealthy enough to do a proper job of it, it would be completely pointless, a waste of time and savings. Not having much money, it seemed senseless to spend a large portion of whatever I did have to go and be somewhere else for a while, knowing full well that however much I enjoyed it, I would have to come back to a place I didn't like and return to my usual mood and routine, meaning that in the long run, spending hundreds of pounds wouldn't have amounted to anything. I didn't see the point in holidays. And for that, I am a jackass. It's not that I didn't want or hated to travel, far from it. One of my biggest ambitions, like most people, either my age or not, is to explore the world. Travelling professionally, either through travel writing, cross-country food critic, or some other similar career, is one of the things I would love to do most with my life. But that would be a permanent excuse to continue travelling around and seeing the world, or at least the country, something that, unfortunately, I'm not afforded the freedom and luxury to do right now, or probably ever. There are still controversial thoughts I have about holidays that I still stand by. I still feel like getting a bunch of trashy souvenirs of where you go, like keyrings and magnets and a seasonal plush bear with an I love name of specific location logo grotesquely and painfully stitched into its stomach, into its very stomach, is a pointless and shallow way to create or retain memories of wherever you've gone. But then I'm not very materialistic. Or fun. Regardless, the reason I finally made the decision to take a break away from Manchester had nothing to do with a change of mind over my viewpoint on holidays. When I decided to take a few days break somewhere, I still thought it was a pointless exercise, and the pessimist I am believed I'd regret spending the money on something so luxurious and indulgent. I never spend money on myself because I never think that I deserve or need anything self-gratifying. The fact I don't do anything pleasurable or selfish because I don't need it shows you how basic yet twisted my mindset is. Still, I did go away. I was feeling stifled in my daily life, and I had a week's holiday off work to use up. I definitely didn't want to spend it bedbound in my room for a whole week, like I had all my other weeks off. Even if I went to local places, the air would feel the same. I'd still be surrounded by the same kind of people with the same behaviours, the same city with the same scale and architecture that my eyes had grown tired of, the same noises and sights affecting my senses. With my home and work still close by, my personal thoughts and upsets would never be very far away. So, for some breathing room, I threw my beliefs and my personal barriers aside for a while, rush-booked a trip to the Lake District. The Lake District has never been that far away, but until recently I've never really had much knowledge of it or desire to see it. The last time I remember hearing about the Lake District was in 2010, when a lone gunman went on a shooting spree across Cumbria, killing 12 people and wounding 25. So a bad impression to say the least. Not so recently, however, it came up to me again while reading The Road to Little Dribbling, the latest book by Bill Bryson and the first one of his that I read. That was about a year ago. I've since become greatly enamoured with Bill Bryson's books and have read them constantly ever since. I don't remember specific information about what Bryson had to say about the Lake District, or his overall view on it, on account of the fact that I retain the information that I read like an X Factor semi-finalist retains a successful music career. But I did create somewhat of a mental link between the Lake District and the idea of getting a good hike in the country with some peace and quiet. After some research, possibly too much research, as I am neurotically inclined to do before trying anything new, rather than jump in and enjoy the surprise, I settled on visiting either Grange over Sands or Bowness on Windermere. Did I want to go on or over? Grange over Sands looked cosy and relaxing based on what I could glean from Google Maps, but seemed to have less to do in the way of recreation. It also seemed further away from the hills for the purpose of country walking and took an extra crossover on public transport to reach. Windermere, on the other hand, was a hotspot for visitors in the Lake District, so was sure to have plenty to do and lots of places to stay. It also intrigued me that it seemed to take full advantage of being the home of Beatrix Potter, who I really enjoyed as a kid, but I have to admit, it's been a long time since I read anything written by or of her. She was an incredible woman, but I'll talk more about Beatrix Potter later, when I'm in the thick of all the shops and attractions dedicated to milking her literary teat for all it could give. For the record, it's interesting to note that Potter wasn't born in Windermere, she was born in Kensington, in London. Still, Kensington has enough claim to fame, being the location for the headquarters of the Daily Mail, and having a lot of focus on Beatrix Potter there might seem a bit jarring to tourists, putting shops and landmarks of one of the country's best and most creative writers right next to some of its most utterly shit ones. Places generally are dedicated not to where historical figures are born anyway, but to where they do something memorable or monumental, or where they create their work or defining moment or other such notable accomplishment. Which, as it goes, wouldn't be Windermere either. Beatrix Potter lived on the other side of the lake in near Sorey, closer to Hawkshead, which again, I have plenty to say on later. Windermere has more spaces and a more touristy viewpoint though, so many of the gift shops, boat tours, ice cream parlours and other tourist fodder, including the World of Beatrix Potter attraction, are set there. So it was I settled on visiting Windermere. While my hometown wasn't the classiest place, Horwich by the way, and it has as much class as its first audible syllable, it was closer to being a country town than the city where I live now, and I missed that small-scale country atmosphere. I am easily a country boy. I still dress as such, which is possibly the reason I get weird judgmental looks from everyone when I walk down a path in Salford. Scratch that, it's the 837th reason I get weird judgmental looks when I walk down a path in Salford. It's not exactly the norm for a 25-year-old man, a word I'm playing fast and loose with, to not only choose to go to the country village for a holiday, but to go by himself. What can I say? I'd rather let my loose change sit on an open fire and then use my own arsehole as a piggy bank than go to Ibiza or Tenerife or Magaluf. Incidentally, why is it that the youth of England specifically chose Spain to turn into a clubland cesspool? Why do so many British 20-somethings hate Spain so much? What is this secret cultural war they have waged on both Spanish islands and the idea of not acting like total git wizards while they're in them? I've never seen London and always felt quite weird about never doing so. England is a small place, and as the capital, it's the only place in England that about 80% of the rest of the world can name. But I didn't see the point in leaving home to get away from a dirty, crime-ridden big city, just to visit an even dirtier, more crime-ridden bigger one. So I was off to the countryside. I could only afford a few nights rather than a full week, but there were signs that luck was on my side when I realised the week I took off was simultaneously the week containing Black Friday and a nearby football match. Working in retail, this was a relief. I've never worked outside the retail industry, depressingly, but in 5 years I've always managed to cheese my way out of working on Black Friday and have never worked one yet. Take that, co-workers! I woke up drastically earlier than usual on Wednesday morning, either because of excitement or shocking existential self-doubt, a regular 4 a.m. and passed the early hours doing the usual things I do to waste the limited minutes, seconds and heartbeats I have on this planet, until it was time to leave the city behind and indulge myself, if only for a brief few days. I got on a tram to Manchester Piccadilly in the early hours. It was stuffed and sweaty as usual, but having a suitcase stuck to my side the whole time made it even more cramped. The image of sardines packed into a tin can came to mind. As we pulled into Piccadilly and the doors opened, I pushed off and finally took a deep exhale, making the first fresh breath I'd had in 20 minutes. At Piccadilly Station, I waited for my train with a dry sausage barm and a lukewarm can of cola from the in-station's Sainsbury's. Strangely, it wasn't that bad, but then I have low standards. I'll shovel anything into my maw. I got on the train heading for Glasgow to find my reserved seat taken by a sour-looking old woman. Luckily, the rest of the carriage was relatively empty and I had my pick, but still I'm one of those people that sticks to the number on their ticket. Train, cinema, whatever. I know. You loathe my kind. So it irked me to find some woman in my seat breaking the rules, with an expression that said, "If you try to argue, I will bludgeon you with my handbag." The train was warm and comfortable. I don't ride trains very often, but they're still my favourite kind of public transport. You can't get the same air of romance from a city's own tram. The train pulled out and passed familiar territory: Wigan, Preston, Lancaster. Most of the views were made up of grim run-down towns, industrial flats and dull plains of empty grass, all visible through a drab, spiritless drizzle of rain. Not long after passing through Lancaster, however, the landscape began to change. The train skimmed the edge of the coastline and revealed a vast expanse of still water that stretched out into a screen of grey, chalky nothingness. It was a dreary beach covered by cloud and fog, nothing special, but it had been a long time since I'd seen the sea and the country. It was oddly captivating and took me by surprise. I found its emptiness beautiful. Beyond the coast, large milky hills started to rise and fall in the mist, as the scenery altered from flat lands best suited for cities or estates, and started to look just like the British countryside that you always see in trip to England pamphlets or travel books. I started to feel like I was finally getting away from the city, becoming more free. Towns here weren't built across plain, even land. They're made up of white vintage cottages nestled into the side of sloping tree-riddled hills. I passed a handful of wistful hamlets that were already much more pleasing from a distance than the city, until the train pulled into Oxenholme station, where I was to make a switch. The train yard at Oxenholme is a neat, olden little thing, or at least it seemed like that to someone who spends the majority of the public transport time in diluted glass stations that are void of any character. It was a humble station house made of cobbled brown bricks. I stopped off in a quaint but cramped cafe stand for about an hour and had a cheap coffee. A lot of people hate hanging around for prolonged periods and would look to fill a full hour with something other than sitting and waiting. I've always been quite patient, or maybe I'm just a veteran time waster. So I listened to music and stared out the window for an hour. As I did, the rain picked up and started to furiously hammer against the station. When I went outside to wait for the train, the downpour was battering harder than the back room of a chip shop. Although the rain was beating against the station floor and roof with plenty of volume, there was still a quietness to the place. I enjoyed waiting there. The next train I got on would take me directly to Windermere. This one seemed much more, with the best word I can use to describe it, European. The walls were stained yellow plastic and holes riddled the fabric in the seats. I sat behind a group of Americans taking a trip to Britain. They complained a lot about how it had started raining and why it was so grim. I mean, in mid-November, in the middle of the English countryside, who could have predicted such a turn in the cosmic ether? Their main topic of discussion was on Brexit, American government, and foreign policy. Really? Look, I hate to jump to conclusions, but is that all Americans can talk about? You're in the middle of green openness and serenity, regardless of the rain, and still the first and only thing on your mind is politics? Take a day off, for the love of fucking Trump. A middle-aged northerner stopped to give them some advice and tidbits about the lakes, including an interesting fact I already knew, that the Lake District actually only has one true lake. The rest are tarns and meres, including Windermere. The suffix is the giveaway there. The touring Americans really only seem to want to know one thing: where the nearest place to buy an umbrella was. In fairness to them, I hadn't seen rain that heavy all year, last 4 months minimum. The rest of their language was made up of dramatizations and one-liners that I honestly couldn't believe I was hearing. I've been around Americans before. I knew they didn't actually talk as melodramatic and scripted as people did in the movies, and yet these 6 people did. I was blown away. I got off the train in Windermere as the rain was laminating the platform and a wind struck me. The initial view was not what I expected. There was nothing. Across the wooden fence on the opposite side of the rails was just a blank whiteness. The only visible thing was the ticket station. I'd soon realised that this is because the town, like the others I had seen on my journey, sloped downwards towards the lake, with the train station standing at the top of a starkly angled hill. I passed through a familiarly modern glass stall, turned a corner and headed out into the rain. What I saw was a soaked and serene-looking model village, with cobbled shops and warm, ember-lit cafes. The road into the shopping area splits into 2, in the middle of which lies an island with restaurants, sweet shops and haberdasheries. A cocktail bar bathed in neon stood at the end. Surprisingly, the artificial glow didn't clash with the rustic nature of the town. From first sight, the place was very agreeable, although much of my attention was still focused on getting out of the rain. Still, it was hard to escape the gentility of the town, even with the rain fuzzing all around. I had 2 hours until check-in, and decided to make my pick of one of the cafes that lay around. But before I continue, I just have to mention something that I'm sure seems like a small thing to most of you, but in fact meant a great deal to me. While looking around town, I decided that I didn't just want to step into the first cafe I saw. I wanted to be indulgent and go into my favourite looking one after a semi-thorough sweep of the district. Crossing the street towards one of the cafes, a guy on the other side was coming up on the opposite way. The paths are very narrow, you see, and if you're walking spread-shouldered, you'll have to turn to allow someone to pass, something I'm veritably used to in the city, as although the streets are wider, I still find myself constantly turning because they're so full and there are so many people. These people grew up in the city, used to those crowds, whereas I grew up in a small town. I'm always aware of a crowd and always aware of having to negotiate through it. I think after a lifetime of city life, people from there just turn the metropolitan masses around them into white noise. For city folk, the streets may as well be empty in, ironically, the most crowded places in the world. Thousands of people just bump and trudge their way past each other. But I always see them. I always avoid bumping into them. I'm always the one stepping away, making the effort. Nobody else does. Nobody cares if they bump or shove me, or anyone else. It's always me. Always. That's the small town way. And so, approaching a collision course with another pedestrian and assuming that, like in every other similar situation, basic acknowledgement of me wouldn't play a part, imagine my surprise when the fellow stopped, stepped aside, said excuse me, walked around me, and flashed me a smile. My eyes visibly widened. I nervously said thank you and hurried along as I always do, but I was in a state of bewilderment. He walked around me. He walked around me. And he said excuse me. I'm sorry, can I say it one more time? It feels so good. He walked around me. I'm sure you, listener, are wondering why I'm making such a big deal about this. Go spend 6 months in Manchester and you'll see. People don't do that. People never do that. If I wanted humanity from Manchester, I'd have to point a gun at someone's head and rob it out of them. I was stunned at someone recognizing and catering to me on the street for a change. That's my job. Doubtless that man will ever hear this, but thank you, kind stranger. Thank you for recognizing me. I hadn't had that in a long time and haven't had that since. For me, individually, what I'm used to and my reasons for even being on a break there, it set more of a good first example of Windermere than any of you could possibly know. I strolled on, delighted, in search of a coffee shop. One in particular looked warmer than the others because its windows were steamed up and it was difficult to see inside, making it all the more inviting. I stepped out of the rain and into utter comfort. I'd never stepped into somewhere and looked around mystifiably with my mouth wide open before, but here I did. I must have looked like a kid in a John Lewis advert coming downstairs to see presents on Christmas Day. I had stumbled into the quaintest, comfiest coffee shop I'd ever had the chance to visit. Fairy lights dotted the edge of the front window, casting a cushioning glow onto the seats facing it. The decor went from a clean yet classic look, with a cosy corner I could see in the back housing a sofa and a bookshelf. The place was simultaneously spacious and snug. Coming in from the rain, it felt like heaven. The staff said hello to me as I walked in, and I felt very welcomed in probably the toastiest, friendliest little cafe I can ever remember visiting. And I visit some cafes, let me tell you. I sat facing the window, the only customer at the time, and a girl came to take my order. This woman could have encouraged me to put a mortgage up just to buy thin air. She was informal yet respectful, and I wanted to clone her and put a clone each in every single cafe, coffee shop and bistro across the country. She was the perfect waitress for a tea room like this. I ordered, I'm not kidding about this, toast that cost £2.15. 2 slices. That's about £1.07 for a toasted slice of bread. I can get a full loaf for less than £1. And do you know what? I was glad to pay it. I assume the extra cost went towards charge for sitting in and table service, in which case they undercharged me. The atmosphere and the custom was worth so much more. I also got a pot of tea that came with a sweet little complimentary ginger biscuit. She brought it over in an infuser and asked if I had used one before. I had not. I am a filthy Neanderthal used to dropping a PG tips into lukewarm water. The tea was very nice and I ended up getting my money's worth by drinking about 6 cups. The waitress recommended topping up my hot water so it could last longer, but feeling burdensome I first passed, then changed my mind because I'm a walking nightmare. The manager behind the counter reminded me that it was no trouble because the water was just tap water and took no effort to boil, something I legitimately forgot. See? Nightmare. As I whittled away at the minutes, I sat looking out the window. The shop's sign swung by the door reading sugar and spice. I made a mental note to remember it so that I could recommend it, which I do here unwaveringly. I stared out at the rooftops of the town, noting to myself that Windermere looked even more pleasing in the grey sullen rain than Manchester did in the purest summer light, not least of all because that's when all the twatty teenagers come out. Windermere on first glance seemed like the kind of place that was perfect for elderly people to spend their days pottering about, which made it pretty well suited for me. If you haven't guessed yet, I'm a 70-year-old weary-minded grumpus trapped inside the body of what looks like a 17-year-old World of Warcraft expert. Help! Get me out of this skin! I don't even play Warcraft! Why is there still so much acne? I shouldn't be in this flesh. I should be in a retirement home watching Monk reruns. Release me! I must have been in there for about an hour and a quarter reading my book, looking out the window and making a mortal enemy out of my bladder. I felt a calmness wash over me, a feeling of having life to myself, something I hadn't felt in a long time as I came to an immediate personal reflection. I already regretted leaving it this long to take a break. I really regretted it. I had a walk around until it was time to check into my room at the guest house. I had booked at the Windermere, a highly rated vintage-looking hideaway just a 10-minute walk from the station. As I walked up the winding road, the sidelines were dotted with neat, scenic lodges, all with pleasantly rural names. Ravensworth, Cedar Manor, Woodlands Cottage. This wasn't a town. This was a live-in muscle relaxant. I was sure I'd wandered into the film set from some kind of ITV3 afternoon show my mum used to watch, like Heartbeat or Last of the Summer Wine. I went to check into my room, greeted by the guest house manager, an amicable man named Anthony Pete. Anthony took the time to give me a complimentary map of the area and highlight certain eateries and hotspots on it. He drew small circles as he told me the names of various places to get food and drink, but without permanent labels. It just turned out that half an hour later I had a map with meaningless little circles all over it. Still, Anthony was a bright guy who gave me the information I needed in a friendly manner and let me go on my way. He also had a grey twirly moustache that put me in mind of Kenneth Branagh's Poirot, but with the commitment to go the whole hog with a complimentary beard. The place was quiet and clearly kept by friendly people, giving the immediate impression I'd chosen right in staying there. I settled into my room, cosy if a little reminiscent of my grandma's house. It was so relaxing to lie on a bed that's main concern was comfort and not room conservation for a change, that I instantly and inadvertently had a nap. I told you I was an old man. You young whippersnappers never listened to your elders. I don't know how long for, but it was getting dark by the time I woke up. I wasn't in a rush to make the hours fly by and decided to just spend the rest of my booking day having a stroll around and going for dinner somewhere. Walking about, the thing that hit me about Windermere is that for the tourist central spot of the lakes, it still felt very grounded and human. People clearly lived here, and it had enough regular amenities to do so. It didn't feel like a tacky schlockfest erected to pander to travellers and foreigners. It felt like a potentially warm home. It still had after-work traffic jams and people blaring their music too loud, something that would have annoyed me greatly back home, but made me feel like where I was still real. It was strangely comforting. A picturesque town that made me feel somewhere new and free, with enough small flaws to diminish any intimidation or high standard. Because of the earlier heavy rain and slight flooding, however, the streets were almost completely clear of other pedestrians on a Wednesday evening. I ate at a corner Italian restaurant called Cafe Italia, which was a little adventurous for me. I rarely have Italian food, usually only a few times a year. It just isn't my thing. Very heavy on the stomach and often drowned in sauce. But it looked very warm and quiet inside, and in the spirit of spontaneity, I abandoned my usual aversion to Italian food. All the staff were young, attractive, and had Italian accents, which is a good sign for the authenticity of the food, but I always feel a bit judged and intimidated being served by people my own age. The lasagna I ordered was compact in a soup bowl, but very flavourful and stuffing. Though I could probably count to how many lasagnas I've had in my life off the top of my head, it was still probably the best out of all of them. I had nothing but free time with the rest of my evening, but I did feel a tad rushed and made slightly anxious by the staff's behaviour. They acted quite coldly, and at one point I caught them all gathered together, looking up at me from the bar below and snickering. I don't know what this was about. For some reason I seem to get this regularly. My guess would have been because they found it amusing in some strange way that a young, aloof-looking adult would be eating alone on a Wednesday night at a romantic Italian bistro, which, while I admit is odd, 1, I was on my goddamn holiday, and 2, I've had similar things happen under other circumstances. I get stared at a lot when I go out to eat, alone or otherwise. It's baffling, and does nothing to help ease my anxiety or my confidence. So I got out of there a bit quicker than I would have liked, which is a shame because the food and drink was well priced, and the atmosphere of the room itself was very comfortable. There was little else to do on a midweek evening in the quieter area of town, and I felt unusually tired from lugging my suitcase around all day. So I headed back to the hotel. I hadn't felt like I'd gotten the most out of my first hours in the lakes, but then I wasn't there to rush through everything. I was there to unwind and do what I wanted to on a whim. I was sure I'd make up for the wasted time tomorrow anyway. So, after a lethargic yet promising first day, I retired to my room and, if anything, made the most out of, for once, sleeping in a plush, snug, well-built bed.